welcome to those who are already in here. And Liepollo, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Anna, and thanks to everybody who's here. As Anna has already said, my name is Liepollo Diepollo. My surname is Pheko. I'm based in Johannesburg, South Africa, but I'm a child of many, many places. So I'm really excited to see old colleagues and new colleagues as well. This is also my first talk. So, you know, fancy that, just lunging straight into it, never having participated in one before, but I'm very honored to have the platform. So I would like to talk today really about exactly that, exploring the intersection of biology, biopolitics, bioracism, bio and pharmacolonialism in the time of COVID. And the like three key clusters that I'm going to talk to, that I'm using to frame my remarks. And I'd be appreciative if my presentation could go up as well. But the first is really to think around really broadly the narratives that situate health aspects of Corona, particularly the disinvestment of states. The second piece of that is really thinking around the neoliberal market orthodoxy, corporate power, and basically how this impacts on Black and brown women specifically and shoves us down the list. And lastly, you know, the WTO and the WHO. Are these really just rubber stamps for, you know, for global philanthro capitalism? People talk about, you know, your Bill Gates and these other personalities who have now taken on massive voices in the role in this space. So I think that it would be useful for us to think around some of those issues. So basically, my first question is really to ask us, what exactly is biopolitics, and what does it mean in relation to the coronavirus? And I'm not sure if you'd like to have some responses to that, either in the chat as I proceed with my talk. But I'd like us to just think around that. What is biopolitics and what does it actually mean in the context of the coronavirus? So as a starting point, I think it's important to talk about this complex web of social, political, economic challenges that have been brought about by this coronavirus pandemic, right? So really, it's really a case of the kind of actual type of biopolitical paradigm that's dictated by this pandemic. And it's actually understood as the implementation. I understand this as biopower of the state, which increases all of its presence, becomes this omnipresent, almost all-knowing, all-seeing, all-visible, all-present figure in every part of our society, of our normal life. And this is all in the name of ensuring the biological security of citizens, right? And this is linked, of course, with questions of migration, so biogeography. It's also linked with the questions of who is and is not viewed as a health threat, which I'll say more about later. It's linked to the notion of what states actually mean and what belonging actually is, especially in the era of the coronavirus. The notion of also passports, vaccine passports, which are then, of course, going to mediate our movement from one place to the other and give some kind of seemingly preferential treatment, a hierarchy of belonging, a hierarchy even of personhood that could be emerging. It sounds like this really strange dystopian fantasy that we are walking into. One keeps hoping that, you know, maybe Will Smith is coming to save us, but clearly he isn't. So modern biopolitics is a combination of different forms of social control, state strategies, and that's aimed to ensure that survival and biosecurity are then the key to this institution building. So the institution building that has been built now around the corona pandemic is linked to states, it's linked to pharmaceuticals, it's linked to social security and public health, it's also linked to the public education system, housing, water, sanitation, it's linked to digital economics. It's basically been hinged into every aspect of our lives. Somebody there? So secondly, the second point I'd like to make is really around hyperglobalization and what some people have called the epidemic of affluence. So when the COVID-19 pandemic has indicated that the previous experiences of 2008, 2008 have clearly not, unfortunately, translated into any major global, multilateral or preparedness strategy. We have learned absolutely nothing in the last 10 or 12 years. So since early 2020, when the virus started moving freely along the lines of the pathways of trade and international capital. Now, given this spread and this transmission pattern, one would argue that communicable diseases associated with economic development, like diabetes and cancer, would also be on the watch list, but they haven't been. And this is as elaborated by many, a lot of literature. This indicates a global transmission pattern whereby upper middle classes, who are the ones who are mainly in motion, were initially affected by, thereby acting as the primary vectors to the working class or the non-working class across populations. I think one of the things that initially when Corona landed in South Africa, we were like, this is yet another strange thing where, you came and you took our land, and now you're coming and you're giving us funny bugs. And it's kind of like a strange recontracting and the strange tropes that are very familiar to kind of like centuries old patterns of occupation, now the occupation of this strange virus, right? So then as COVID is then, it's really a contradiction of this notion that it's the disease of poverty. And this has been seen, this contradiction of behavior, of social planning, of public security, and also of the ways in which it has become securitized and policed is very contradictory, looking at the ways in which urban planning, urban movement have been monitored and have been used as to police and to punish poverty, to punish Black and brown people, particularly in working and the working poor, as we often call them in South Africa. Now, this disease of affluence has proved to be a very heavy hitter, especially for people who are low income or economically marginalized and dispossessed. It struck very directly in relation to jobs, of course, and it's deepened existing social inequalities, and it has actually exacerbated and illustrated, as we have seen, existing fragilities. Now, I'd like to suggest that, in fact, that the coronavirus it's not a new pandemic, right? It's a pandemic upon many pandemics. So many pandemics include pandemics of state withdrawal, many pandemics of completely unfettered corporatization of what should be public utilities, public services, health, water, and so forth. And I think that the next is, I'd like to also make a point around the very poor attention that's been paid to the long-term impacts of society. So, this really awful public planning, lack of public planning, this disaster capitalism that seems to be the way in the pattern, the motif of this moment. Again, I'd like to suggest that this is not new. So, Hurricane Katrina, the tsunamis, and so forth. There have been many tsunamis, there have been many hurricanes, there have been many pandemics, including the HIV/AIDS pandemic, including the Ebola pandemic as well. And yet we behave as though this was new to us, particularly in the global north. So one of the things I think that's been extremely key to all of this is this racialized, very racialized approach to the corona pandemic, and the surprise that seems to be expressed particularly by news outlets like CNN and BBC that a lot more African people haven't died, that we've been surprisingly, in inverted commas, adept at handling this pandemic. And of course we've got the social, the medical, the biomedical infrastructure. We've been handling these sort of harsh health hardships for at least a couple of generations, specifically because of the disinvestment in healthcare, the disinvestment that has been brought about by high levels of intergenerational indebtedness, extremely problematic public-private partnerships, which mean that states also have to subsidize and pay back at very high interest rates many of these social infrastructural debt-related loans as well. Coming to women and biopolitics. So, from my own intellectual standpoint, the biopower and biopolitics conceptual frame is really very critical and very central to the notion of race, to the notion of reproduction, to the notion of gendered identities, especially in this strange time. And these really determine the conditions under which we exist, under which we think, under which we act, and the way in which capitalism considers women in this time. So women have, of course, been subsidizing global economies in different ways, particularly Black and brown women at the low end of global value chains, low end, the worst paid jobs, the furthest away often in terms of ratio of work to home distance. So we subsidize the economy in all sorts of ways, the mainstream or the male stream economy, as I often call it. And in this time, what we're actually seeing is that there's been an attempt to then reassess and to rethink and to recontract Black and brown women's labor in ways that actually exacerbate existing precarity and existing vulnerabilities. And I don't say this because we are vulnerable, but certainly because lack of social care and social infrastructure has meant that we are often working in far more precarious and fragile socioeconomic circumstances. Now, I also want to suggest here that as a building block, we have to rethink the conception of what biopolitics actually means, especially when we relate it to risk, illness, and death, and how these completely operate in favor of really harsh market orthodox economic policies. Some would say neoliberal. And these actually reflect these reflect and often sponge off of the nurturing narratives that predominantly affect working class, Black or indigenous populations. And in the world's periphery, COVID-19 has especially amplified the terrible consequences of austerity policies. So while the US, the UK, and several other countries increased social spending in response to the pandemic, the Brazilian government opted to strengthen economic policies that made it impossible for large parts of the population to adequately isolate from physical contact. And I would say that this is very similar to some of the moves that have been made even by the South African government, who, despite pouring 500 billion rands, which is about, I don't know, 50 billion or $30 billion US, have actually managed to ensure that despite supplying PPEs, supplying masks, that they're actually one of the highest ratios of deaths per 100,000 people in the world of healthcare workers, and we're still puzzled as to why. The other piece of this, in terms of the ways in which biopolitics and biosecuritization of this are playing themselves out in different countries, other than George Floyd, we are seeing as well the increasingly militarization in this moment. So where biopolitics and biosecuritization are being used to then retract civil liberties in ways that we're extremely worried about. So just yesterday, we're in the middle, and I know that unfortunately news doesn't travel very far beyond our country, but it's a big deal to us that there are massive student protests that are taking place. And many of you will have known of the Fees Must Fall movement from 2015, and it's kind of resuscitated. It never really dies down. There are always student protests, because rightly so, they're always, because of the austerity. So what has happened, we're calling this the first COVID casualty of the budget that was recently tabled in late February, actually, basically because this is the origins of these protests are, of course, the lack of fees. So there's been a disinvestment of about 5 billion rand into NSFAS. NSFAS is the student loan. This is what advances student loans. And we're told that this is going into the corona recovery. Yet there is no real recovery. So even in this moment, we're finding that the notion of what states should be and the notion of how biopolitics are then playing themselves out and make it fragmenting and marginalizing further people who are extremely already marginalized in different ways. And I think I want to link this now to the notion of public health and this surveillance state. And I think that this kind of Western-based global governance regime and this whole notion of multilateralism, it seems to be finding a tipping point. And this seems to show that there's the renewed primacy and necessity of strong nation states. Now, in some places, these are very unpopular ideas, but certainly in the global South and in the African context, we view nation states as extremely important. Strong nation states which are able to provide the kind of social utilities that make that make citizenship, belonging, and being sustainable. So states that sustain, basically, states that provide, states that do what they're supposed to do, states that feed, that nurture, states that are able to provide education, housing, healthcare, and so forth. And the reason that this is a strong and political statement is, of course, structural adjustment did the opposite. It completely denuded and stripped and disemboweled states. So we're big on nation states. And it seems like in this moment that this is exactly what many people are seeing, that the state is important because corporatizing public interest, corporatizing public health has led to the sorts of neglect that we're seeing and the lack of the disenfranchisement of millions of people, both in the global South and in the global North, in ways that I don't think have flattened the world, but in ways that have certainly shown that the crevices of international financial architecture do not work anywhere particularly well, including in the United States, clearly, including in the United Kingdom, and so on and so forth. So history shows that pandemics and nation states' responses to them also have the capacity to facilitate geopolitical power shifts, right? So this basically means that nation states have had to retreat into a form of sovereignty and protectionism that hasn't been seen since the end of the Cold War. The downside of this, of course, is that we see new forms of not only criminalization of the other, we also see a state-sanctioned racism, right? So state-sanctioned ways of deciding who is and is not supposed to be surveilled. And this has been facilitated by your tech giants and the governments of quite illiberal democracies who have found this momentum to express themselves. I'm gonna jump through this because I wanna watch my time. But I also wanna say something around here around the ways in which the World Health Organization, for example, has the impetus of the World Trade Organization at a time such as this. So basically, this was really supposed to be the organization that was committed to the principles of the highest attainable standards of health, right? And the fundamental rights of every human being, distinct without any distinction of race, religion, political beliefs, economic or social condition, all the nice stuff, all the things that should make sense in a rational world. And yet what we're seeing at a time such as, and also to add that the foundational principles, however, already indicated the privileging of whiteness, of colonialists, of white men, of colonial interests, of European or Western interests. And this was, even though they were purported to be less central, this really hasn't proven to be the case in practice. Now, as a child of the generation of people who were excessively perforated growing up, you couldn't go to buy milk without somebody jabbing your left arm. I have like scars all over my arms to this day. WEAll understands the notion of having been perceived as being a problem just by virtue of genetics or of race, basically. So Black people need to be jabbed. And this is possibly part of this pharma skepticism that seems to be playing out, as well as the notion that this global health regime, unfortunately, seems to have remained in some respects the same. So the notification for certain infectious diseases, the ways in which this is then used, as an excuse and as alibi by many states, by many cities, the notion of public health responses, disease prevention, and who does and doesn't carry disease, who are not the carriers of disease. And when we link this, of course, with who should and shouldn't cross borders, and the racialization of that, the picture becomes even clearer around, the kind of the bio-racism and the bioterrorism of what this moment potentially could lead to and we're already experiencing. Now, there are a few major actors as well in the absence of, I think, of a coherent multilateral response, including from the WTO. And I'm not going to go into too much detail because it's too granular on the TRIPS flexibilities. But there are a few key actors. I mean, the one is Big Pharma, the other is the Gates Foundation, and the other are basically wealthy global northern governments. Now, what seems to have occurred in this instance is that you have Big Pharma and your big pharmaceutical, philanthropists or your big philanthro capitalists who seem to have used their money, their political influence, and their support for somewhat controversial in some circles or flawed patent systems to turn the tide of the vaccine development and distribution in their own favor. So the distribution of vaccines, notwithstanding the pharma skepticism that I've already mentioned, but the distribution of the vaccines, the hierarchy of life, the hierarchy of who is and isn't worthy. So, predominantly white healthcare professionals who are being privileged at the expense of, again, the Black and brown women, mainly migrant women, who are also key part of the medical infrastructure. Now, the shortages in vaccine supplies due to some of the artificial restrictions as a result of intellectual property rights have actually left wealthier countries, actually wealthy is a dodgy word, isn't it? But have left northern countries or Western countries squabbling at the expense of the global South, who may have to wait longer and pay higher prices for vaccine themselves. And just on that, fun fact is that South Africa, even though we have a massive Johnson & Johnson, we have massive capacity to produce, and Johnson & Johnson have a plant here. Can you believe that we've not even, even though they're produced here, we have not been given preferential treatment or access to those vaccines? And it's a strange thing to watch all of these vaccines being exported to the world while we ourselves are still scrambling. And I think then, I think the good news is that there are countries who in the global South, South Africa and India, who have rebutted this workability against the workability of the flexibilities, the capacity to produce our own pharmaceutical alternatives, to produce our own medication, to relax the voluntary licenses that are allowed under the WTO TRIPS agreement. But these have only come away with terms that end up favoring the licensor. And at a time when we're thinking that this is a life or death situation, this is like a once in a lifetime. And I really hate hyperbolic stuff like unprecedented. If I hear that word one more time, but it is unprecedented. I've never seen anything like it. And I hope nobody else, I hope my children and my children's children never see anything like it. And I also hope that they end up living in a world that isn't entirely masked and that everybody doesn't look like Darth Vader. But this this illustrates that South Africa has also showed the danger of doing bilateral deals between countries and pharmaceutical nations, because what this does is actually undercut the efforts of compulsory and voluntary licensing. And a lot of these deals are extremely opaque and the details are mostly unknown. And they really show that we should be careful around some of these problematic bilateral deals because they reserve excess supplies of vaccine that are available in limited amounts for a small number of countries or populations. So South Africa's rebuttal also mentions the vagueness of pharmaceutical companies' pledges to not enforce patents. But for example, Moderna announced that it wouldn't enforce patents while the pandemic continues. I mean, for crying out loud, what does that mean? How long is that going to be? Could be a week, could be a month, could be a year, could be a decade. Who knows? So what kind of security does that actually give? And I think I'm going to close it right there. And if I've missed out anything, it can probably emerge in conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Liepollo. Maybe, I don't know if you would like to, I mean, I don't know if anyone has a question right away that you would like to ask Liepollo, but I do remember she threw a question at the very beginning and she wanted people to give it some thought before going back to that. But I think if you or any of you, if you want to raise your hands or if you want to use the tool that you have in the on the Zoom because you would like to address a question to her directly or to everybody here, please just let me know. Otherwise, we can probably go to the question. Maybe Liepollo, you would like to ask them again after everything that you have shared.
Sure.
Around that.
Sure. So, I mean, having heard my remarks, again, I'd like to pose the question: what does biopolitics mean in the context of the coronavirus? And that's a free for all for anybody to respond to.
Amanda. And then Steve. Steve, did you unmute because you wanted to talk?
I was about to, yeah.
Okay, okay. Go ahead, and Amanda, we'll go.
Me?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Liepollo. That was amazing. So much information that I would love to dive into more with you. But one of the things that I'm really interested in that you highlighted a lot is TRIPS, right? And the intellectual property rights regime and the ways in which that's, for me, I think, yeah, sort of the power politics makes a lot of sense, right? Because the US was a huge push, like creator of the WTO and a lot of that regime. And within our own country, pharmaceutical is by far the largest lobbying group, right? And so they spend more than, I think, yeah, like almost a third more than even oil and gas in influencing policy. But I was wondering about sort of what your view is on patents more generally, right? Because I think, you know, I see it often as it emerged as a way to reduce the to allow for a form of globalization without allowing for reverse engineering, right? And for the actual creation of you know, manufacturing and other types of areas. But there is always that argument, particularly for pharmaceuticals, right? That it's like, you're not going to have the innovation and people aren't going to put in all of this money to do the research if they're not going to like ensure that they'll be able to do it. So I just wanted to ask your sort of more general ideas on patents and intellectual property rights and things like this.
Shall I answer them one by one, Anna, or should we take a couple, or what do you suggest?
You're on mute, Anna.
Sorry. So no, I was going to ask you, Liepollo, how do you feel more comfortable? Would you like to listen to a couple of questions and then respond to them, or each? It's really up to
maybe one or two, maybe in a couple of clusters, if that's okay with everybody.
Sounds wonderful. So Steve, yeah, it's going to be your.
Well, mine wasn't a question, Liepollo. I just wanted to let you know I was really impressed with your talk, and my head is still reeling. I mean, you have covered such a terrain there that it will take me some time just to formulate a question, to be quite honest. So thank you very, very much indeed, and I shall just look forward to the other questions and your answers to them.
Okay. Anyone else? Maybe I missed some of the hands if you raised them. I'm not sure. Okay, so maybe Liepollo, you would like to respond to Amanda, and that will probably bring us to the next.
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, so I mean, there's so many different ways of viewing IPR, right? And patents. So as a political weapon, as a development instrument, especially for developing countries or countries in the global south. I think the ways in which patents have been weaponized by certain countries and by your large pharma organizations, by big tech, for example, the cannibalistic ways in which your Mark Zuckerbergs will buy out 12-year-old kids in their garages who've got this little app. It's like, I will buy you out because we don't want you to compete, essentially. And other than being non-competitive and just it feeds into the notion of really strange and huge gluttonous monopolistic companies which don't also enable other forms of innovation. I agree, but also I think that we need to differentiate. So at a time like this, when we're thinking about health, what are the health implications and the public health and the human rights and the civil liberties implications of refusing licensing and for rejecting the notion of producing generic, less expensive generic drugs. And we've been here before, right? So we were here before with the HIV/AIDS pandemic, with both Brazil and South Africa played a very important role in ensuring that conversation and that the TRIPS special license was evoked, and lives were saved. And I think that we also need to think sector by sector, and that this is contextual. So in the context of this moment we're in right now, in the context of, for example, needing to think around governments who don't have the mechanism to buy large bulk amounts, millions and millions for their citizens. Why is it so difficult to think about the possibility of relaxing licensing? And I mean, look, I have no brief per se for big pharma and for your large global conglomerates. I mean, I just think that it is corporate greed. It is, as cliched, it is corporate greed. It is gluttonous. It is absolutely against the notion of well-being and of nurturing economies, of nurturing industries, and of industries that are actually centered around people, that are centered around state priorities and state policy. And this is exactly what happened when we have unfettered where corporates have become unfettered. So I mean, at the WTO, as we're aware, corporates have been able to sue nations because they can't get their pretty little way, throwing their toys out. So I think that as part of this kind of discourse of flattening and recentering, where governance should be, where the nation state should be, certainly sovereignty over patents should be a part of this conversation. But I'd love to hear other people's views as well.
Catherine, I'm aware that you raised your hands, but if anyone would like to add anything to what she just shared with Amanda, please feel free. And otherwise, Catherine, open your mic.
Okay, I'm a bit like Stevie Liebehang, and then mind's swirling, and so I don't at all have any intelligent question to answer, because there's so much in 20 minutes, quite extraordinary. What I'm just sort of wondering about is do you have any hope or sort of any sense of the sort of potential for any of the big supranational institutions to play a positive or constructive role here? And I mean, what it seems like these groups like the UN just so helpless in the face of such extreme vaccine nationalism. They kind of say, oh, please don't take so many, and that's as much as they can do. The WHO is saying the same thing. UN has been, I think, inconspicuous by its absence this last 12 months. So I'm just curious, do you have any sense of any of those supranational institutions that might figure out a way to play a proactive, positive, necessary role?
Look, great question. I don't know, Steve, do you want to add to that?
Well, Liebehang, if you don't mind, I was just going to supplement it, Catherine, just thinking along similar lines. It was just in relation to this growing reaction there is against neoliberalism. So we now hear that corporations, I mean, whether they're genuine or not, I leave it up to others to judge that, but some of them are about taking on this wider social responsibility, moving away from the freedmen and the shareholders are the only concern here. How does that, do you think, play out, and are we to take that as some sign of a change?
Thank you. Thanks for those interesting questions. I mean, so what is multilateralism? I think that's possibly sort of where we can begin. And whose interests have these institutions been representing? And for the last while, it seems as though there's been a bit of a power imbalance, and we tend to think around multilateral cooperation, and we've treated that as a proxy for multilateralism. We've also, I think, taken these institutions as being the anchors, as being the most appropriate conduits of multilateralism, and I think multilateral governance is shifting, and it must shift. I don't think that there's been much that's been helpful for that has emerged, because there's been such a tendency towards protectionism. There's been such a tendency towards new narrow nationalisms, and it's quite alarming to me, the levels of xenophobia and jingoism and so forth, and the increase in inequality that has actually emerged. And then you're quite right, Catherine, that it's almost like the UN sort of like just, you know, throwing up their hands and telling everybody to play nicely, but not really doing anything to enforce, to build equilibrium, to let alone to sanction states in any particular way. The G20 has tried to lend some measure of political support. I think the only sort of visible multilateral institution, of course, for obvious reasons, and the most audible, has been the World Health Organization, which has some of its own issues and I think its own critiques, which I've alluded to. I think the problem is that we're so interconnected that we can only get over this through forms of international cooperation, but I'm not sure whether those institutions which have been quite faulty and faltering and sometimes problematic, sometimes inconsistent over the last years, and of course sometimes which are part of reinforcing existing power imbalances, they're not always in good faith themselves, because they themselves don't seem to realize their own part in reinforcing racism, enforcing different and differentiated governance prescripts, depending on who they're talking to. And I think that this is probably a good time for us to rethink what multilateralism actually means. What does cooperation actually mean? And do we need these sorts of institutions to do so? Do we need these sorts of institutions to govern us in the way that they have been purporting to? What do we actually have to show? And this is I don't have the answer for this. What do we actually have to show for the last 40 to 50 or 60 years of multilateralism in relation to well-being indices, in relation to the growth in education, in relation to the growth in or the improvement in mortality rates, in the kinds of development indices that should indicate that this is a world that is being governed differently, that is being governed with equity, with an equity dividend at heart. So I'm not sure, what do we actually have to show for the last 50 or 60 years of this form of multilateralism? That's my answer to a question is another question.
Thank you, Liepollo. Anything that you would like to add, or any thoughts that those questions had bring into your mind?
Well, I'd be interested to hear from others, actually, and I'd like to throw something back at us. So the one is the idea of securitization of states, especially right now, and how this seems to be, this kind of biosecuritization of states, biosecuritization of movement. How do we respond to this? Or what do we think is the pathway out of this? Or is there a pathway out of this? Is this the way things are just going to be? This whole notion of the securitization of health and of human relations. What does this actually mean? And I'd be interested to hear from us in this regard.
And I'm happy to offer a first thought as others pile in. I mean, one thing that's been so fascinating to me is that the interpretation of risk and acting on risk, and just, come back to the previous point around vaccine hoarding and, buying so many more vaccines than your population would need, just to hedge bets, and just, that extreme, I think, selfishness. I think the UK had vaccinated 1/5 of its population, and only 23 people in the whole continent of Africa, and 23 health workers in Ghana had at one point had received the vaccine at one moment in January. And I'm also reminded, just down the road from here in Glasgow, at the beginning of the coronavirus crisis, and this happened across the UK, people who've been living rough on the streets suddenly were found rooms in hotel rooms, not because they were sleeping rough and that's pretty shit for human beings to have to sleep rough, but because they were a risk to the wider population. And it's extraordinary. So again, I'm coming back with another question. We're going to play ping pong on this, Liepollo, but they're the sort of lenses I see in, how risk has become so extraordinarily self-orientated, and the interpretation of that, I think, in the last 12 months. And even people rarefy, COVID's been so beautiful with mutual aid and health self-help groups and so on, but they're just in local communities. They're to immediate geographical neighborhoods. I haven't seen the global justice equivalent of a mutual aid group. Maybe it is out there, but I'm not aware of it. I'd love to be proved wrong on that. There's something.
And just to ping pong back on that is, this whole notion, this whole discourse of well-being and risk and self-care, it's not really self-care, is it? It's self-interest, actually, and it's actually it's around a few people who are able to congregate their class interests, their suburban interests, their own personal health interests, eat well. They're able to congregate around good food, good living, because they can. So those who always could continue to be able to. And as you say, if there were spare hotel rooms all this time, why on earth weren't people being housed in the first place? Why is there even a crisis of homelessness? But now that people are viewed, and this is again this whole idea of who is and isn't perceived to be a risk, right? Who is and is perceived as the purveyor and the carrier of disease, who should be contained, and it's also the politics of containment, not the politics of care. It's got nothing to do with care. And it's also got nothing to do with building a pathway to a different economy. So I was on another sort of similar panel last week, and we were talking about how, as a critique of social protection, and an important part of social protection, as much as it's salient and central to any decent society, this idea of keeping people precarious and hopeful that they will join an economy that actually doesn't want them there. So this notion of the working poor, people who are kept marginal, get a few quid, get a bit of dough, just enough to mollify, just enough to keep you calm, just enough so that you're not so angry that you actually revolt around, revolt and uprise and actually have a revolution. And I'm actually developing quite a cynical approach, and I don't want to, but I'm becoming quite cynical about what the so-called social contract that that dole and different forms of social benefits represent, because they are not about changing the system. They're about tinkering around the edges and maintaining a working poor or non-working poor who are not too hungry that they're going to do something dramatic, and who actually there's no interest in actually transforming the kind of economics that we actually do, the economies that we actually have, the definitions of work, the forms of work. It's a pathway to nowhere, and that's for free.
Okay, I'm reminded of sort of Marx's description of the capitalist state as a committee of the bourgeois, the bourgeoisie just placating people's needs just in the smallest way in order to offset the profound disruption to the system. Yeah, absolutely. We've seen that acutely.
Absolutely.
Just have a question though. Don't you think that, I feel like some people have finally realized that other people impact them, like that they can live in a gated community, right, and think that the health of the people who serve them food is not their business. And now they realize that it is. So, I don't think it's all bad. I do think COVID is bad, and don't get me wrong, but I don't think that the realization that other people's health is, that you can't be isolated, that your own self-care is not the only thing that matters, that you must care for everybody in a society, or you will not live through this pandemic, right? And so I think there's some really, obviously not everyone in the US, for example, has gotten it, but I think there's been a shift in recognizing that universal health care is a thing that is important, not just for the people who didn't have it before, but for everybody if we all want to be healthy. So, I mean, I think there has been some realizations that you have to have clean air and clean water, and it goes over into your gated community, you know, and you just can't be completely selfish, even if all you care about is yourself. So.
And also that, you know, this whole, that there are no real bubbles, and people talk, I mean, I know the UK, they're talking about, you know, you have your bubble, but what does a bubble actually mean? Because at some stage you have to go to the supermarket, you know, at some stage you have to engage with each other. So this notion that we can completely insulate, I mean, I don't know if it's entirely true. I mean, there's one horror story I heard about when my chiropractor said her neighbor, he was holed up for 6 months, and, you know, in this bunker mentality, and he went to the supermarket and he came back with corona. So I mean, this notion of being germaphobes and being and anesthetizing ourselves from the reality of the world is probably a bit of a fallacy. Not sure. Do you have a Matt? Do you want to say something?
Well, yeah, just extending on that, and thank you first for just bringing the whole notions of biopower and biopolitics into the conversation. They're really important lenses, I think. But just in terms of well-being and our work here and kind of growing this movement. So we're joining today from all around the world, and I think that's part of what makes this whole group so exciting. And recognizing too that the notion of well-being therefore calls on us so much to maintain an international perspective, and that sort of the call recently from the World Health Organization Director General, I think he ended that call saying solidarity is the only way out. And I think that's true, whether we're talking about pandemics or biodiversity or climate change or whatever these issues are. You won't achieve a well-being, we know that, in any one community. All of these issues, all of these phenomena are now crossing, and they're going to continue to cross, and they're continue to change. That it really does seem like so much of our response that's so, in some cases, insular or focused predominantly at the level of nations or something like that, is really a fundamental obstacle, right, to really dealing with these issues. And so I guess I'm just wondering, in the context of well-being and building well-being economies, what's your sense in terms of really centering that as an international focus, and what does solidarity mean, I guess, to you, given these interrelationships between health and well-being across communities?
Interesting one. Oh, it's a great question. What is solidarity? I mean, it evokes all kinds of. It's an important political imperative. It can also become quite fluffy depending on who's saying it, and yet that really denudes it of its meaning and of its power. You know, solidarity is the stuff of action. Solidarity is the stuff of concerted ground-up movement building. I think solidarity is also the stuff that works when our states aren't as responsive as we would like them to be, when multilateralism, as we've talked about, is also not as effective as we would like it to be. And when one thinks about the ways in which solidarity can potentially work, you know, international civil rights movements, international climate change, you know, stuff that is often, yes, it's sometimes housed inside processes like, you know, Paris or whatever, but a lot of the people to people on the ground movement building doesn't per se require institutions in the formalized way. It doesn't per se even require our states to be, you know, states to be ready, because I don't know if they ever will be. I think states are inherently very conservative spaces. There are a series of compromises and institutions and political bartering. So states are quite conservative and slow moving and slow to respond to change, which is why sometimes change must happen and arrives in very surprising ways and sudden ways, right? And I think when we talk about solidarity as an expression of global power and day-to-day love, and as also an expression of the kind of kinship, global kinship, which transcends different ideological framings, which transcends, I think, frankly, some of the incompetence of your international institutions. I see that as a way of actually expressing the sort of well-being and reframing the kind of well-being that we need to see. I don't know what the pathway is, though, because what I see at the moment is a complete recontracting and a very resilient and stubborn attachment to the old way, right? So, people talk about build back better. And of course, that means building back more of the same. So we were going back to 2008, we're going to do more of the same. And I'm trying to think my way out of, again, I'm trying to think my way out of a bit of cynicism around this being some great tipping point moment. It should have been, but I'm not sure. I think capital has caught up and gone ahead and is reframing itself very quickly. So, compassionate capitalism, people like your big pharma industries and your big philanthro capitalists also presenting themselves. They are doing, as far as they're concerned, that's also a form of social solidarity. So I think even the languaging and the framing becomes so slippery. I don't know how we get out of per se well-being economics and on a grand scale, but I do know that the kind of day-to-day and the sort of community building that we're doing. So I mean, a lot more people growing their own food in my community. That's a good beginning. A lot more attention to caring for each other's children. That's a good beginning. A lot more attention in terms of subsidizing each other's time. So, I mean, some of us rotate and look after each other's kids, and it's not big, and maybe it doesn't have to be big, but I would prefer that it was big, because then you have bigger shifts a lot more quickly.
Thank you so much, Liepollo. I'm aware of the time. It's 4 minutes to the hour. And Isabel, thank you so much for taking over. I don't know if anyone is waiting to ask a question to comment on what Liepollo had just said. But if you don't, Liepollo, I would like you to have the last few minutes if you would like to wrap up the whole talk, if you would like to add anything else or something that you would like to share before saying see you soon in the next WEAll talk. It's so up to you.
Yeah, I would actually. I'm actually looking for it. I had my final remarks already and they're suddenly hiding from me. So just give me literally 30 seconds. Okay, there it is. Yeah, no, I'd rather close with a poem, because I think at times like this, poetry helps, poetry feeds, poetry nurtures, and poetry is part of the language that I use to feed myself. And I shared this, I think, at one of our previous, when we had one of our previous well-being sessions, myself and Pedro were co-facilitating. So I'm gonna just read this poem, and that's my well-being missive from me to you. So I'll read half of it. Transformation is the spirit changing gear. It is the element of one's being becoming aware that the future is always far when your feet are firmly planted here, attached to the present and rooted in fear. Change is the pulse of possibility, pulling from the periphery to the now. It is the questions unanswered, the journey through the whys and the hows. It is a sojourn through darkness with a solitary flame as guide. It is the sole destination, the navigator and the ride. It is the blue light revelation revealed when morning cracks. It is abundance when you know how it feels to live in lack. It is the race, the car, the ref, the scorecard, and the track. It is eyes fixed to the horizon with angels at your back. It is the purpose held with reverence, reverted to when doubt attacks. It is an energizing uncertainty, leaving no option of turning back, always shifting, always present, demanding of us to be more than who we see ourselves to be than we were before. And tomorrow is an infinite portal with no ceiling and no floor. There is only the ledge that beckons us and wings designed for us to soar. There is a me that I could be if I just let her breathe outside, a thundering song that I could sing if I just let her breathe outside.
I don't think there is any better way to finish this talk, Liepollo Pheko. Thank you, because every single thing that you have shared is so important to reflect at, and we need to go through this. And I'm going to listen to this talk once again to capture everything that is being said here today. Thank you for your time. Thank you, and everybody, for showing up today. And I hope I'll see you really soon, because this month of March, we have a special edition, we call it. We will talk with the 36 by 36 women, and Amanda Jano, who is present right now here, will be part of that wonderful special edition talk. So thank you again, Liepollo Pheko, a huge hug from Spain, and a huge hug for everybody. And thank you for joining us today.